Okay, welcome back, students. We're here in Chapter 2, and we're continuing to deal with the issues in Chapter 2, but most importantly, we're entering this area where we have to start doing computations. And the first things we're going to do is compute wages and salary, and especially deal with overtime issues in that computation. So to begin, we want to look at this particular slide here and remind ourselves that these issues, these common pay periods, are going to come up in these problems. We have to be very aware of this. We can have biweekly pay periods that occur every 2 weeks. In a 52-week year, we would have 26 biweekly pay periods. Semi-monthly, two times per month, 12 months in a year, 24 semi-monthly pay periods. Monthly, of course, 12. Weekly, of course, 52. But these two here, these first two, biweekly and semi-monthly, when you first hear about this, you might think those are the same, but they're not. They're very different. One would involve 26 pay periods. The other would involve 24 pay periods. You can have different pay periods within the same organization. Very common in a union contract, for example, where the contract calls for a certain pay period by agreement, and then you might have another group of employees that aren't unionized that you have a different agreement with in a different pay period. So that's not uncommon, and it's no violation of the Fair Labor Standards Act to do that. You just have to realize you may encounter that. Okay, to calculate overtime pay, there's the textbook describes, and there are in practice, two methods. These are very similar methods. There's not a great deal of difference, and you'll see that as we talk about this. Here's the most common method. Calculate the gross pay, and it's the employee's regular rate times 40 hours. Now, we're not always going to have that regular rate given to us. Sometimes we have to compute the regular rate, and we'll see that come up later. But then, given that you calculate that and get the 40-hour total, the overtime portion is simply 1.5 times the employee's regular hour rate. That gives you an overtime rate, and you multiply that times the hours in excess of 40. That would be probably the first way you would approach it, having never done this. This is a common sense way to deal with that issue of overtime. In other words, find the total compensation per hour in the overtime period, which would be 1.5 times the regular hourly rate. Do the multiplication to get the overtime pay and add that to the regular total pay. The other method is very similar. It simply says calculate the gross pay, take all the hours worked, including the overtime hours, and then apply the regularly hourly rate times that. And then compute what you would call an overtime premium, and that would be half of the regular rate, 1/2. Then simply the add-on to this first calculation here, this is the first calculation, the add-on to that would be the overtime premium times the number of overtime hours worked. Mathematically, these two methods are going to result in exactly the same gross pay. So there's no difference, and in most of the problems you do, it can be your choice as to which way you look at it and which method you use, because you will wind up with the same answer either way. These are the two methods. One uses an overtime premium, the other doesn't. But I think you need to be aware of this overtime premium idea, because we do use that idea in other problems as we go forward. Okay, let's look at these two examples, the two methods of calculating overtime with the same set of data here. This employee has an hourly rate of $18.50 per hour. He worked overtime, over 40 hours, 49 hours. So first you get the regular total, which is the $18.50 times 40, and then you compute an overtime pay per hour, $18.50 times 1.5, which equals $27.75. Multiply that times the 9 hours of overtime. Here's the overtime pay. Add them together, total gross pay. In the second method, you simply took the $18.50 times the total hours worked, including overtime, got this first subtotal of regular pay, then you computed an overtime premium, half of the regular rate of $18.50 or $9.25. Multiply that times the overtime hours. That's the overtime premium. That's added to the first subtotal. You wind up with the same number, $989.75 in total gross pay, including overtime. Okay, a little bit more complexity in this idea here. You can have employees working at different rates because they're performing different jobs. That's acceptable under Fair Labor Standards Act. It happens where you may work so many hours at one rate, and then you take on another task where you're paid a higher rate and you work so many hours there. When overtime occurs, there's a dilemma. What rate should be used to compute the overtime premium, and how do we deal with that? The practice that is acceptable under fair labor has three options in this regard. Pay overtime at the higher rate. That would be to the benefit of the employee, whether they worked at the higher rate at the beginning of their work week or at the end of their work week during overtime, wouldn't matter. You simply decide to give them the higher rate to compute their overtime. So the premium would be based on the higher rate. No employee likely would dispute that method. Okay, in addition to that method, you can calculate the total earnings for all the jobs, divide by the total hours worked to come up with an overall average hourly rate, and then apply the overtime premium based on that weighted average. So the more hours you worked at the higher wage, the higher the weighted average would be, and the higher your overtime premium would be. This is another technique or method that's acceptable to deal with this. And then the last method is the method that says, well, which job were you working on when you worked your overtime? Were you working on the higher rate or the lower rate type of job? And so the overtime premium is applied based on, in actual fact, when you were in the overtime situation, which job were you working on? So all three of those are acceptable, and firms choose those in negotiations with their employees. It may often be in an employment contract or a union contract, and it's a topic that needs to be dealt with because the differences can be substantial in certain situations. So let's look at these three methods here of calculating overtime using these three ideas, where we do the higher rate, which is this first method. We do the rate you were actually at when you worked the overtime, which is the last method. And then the second method is a weighted average of those rates. So pulling some numbers together, here's the lower hourly rate we're using, $17.30. Here's the higher hourly rate for job B. So one is job A, one is job B. We're using that consistently in all three methods. The data set is the same in all three methods. We have 36 hours at the A job or the lower rate job, 8 hours at the B job. So in the first one, we're going to simply compute the overtime hours, which would be 4 overtime hours. See, we have 8 plus 36 is 44 hours, so 4 of those hours are overtime and must be paid at 1.5 times the regular rate. So here we're simply going to use the higher rate to do our overtime calculation. So we compute the regular earnings from job A, the regular earnings from job B without the overtime premium, and then we compute the overtime premium based on the $20.50 regular rate, so its premium is $10.25. We multiply that times the number of hours worked here to get the overtime premium. Then we get the total gross wages by adding job A regular rate, job B regular rate, overtime. In method 2, we're using a weighted average here. So in this particular case, we're taking the 36 hours at the job A rate, the 8 hours at the job B rate. We combine those together and we divide those by the total number of hours worked. And that calculation is shown right here on this line. This is the total of the job A gross, the job B gross, and then divide it by the total hours worked, 44, to get the weighted average rate, and then we pump it up. Then we take a 50% of that, or 1/2, that is the overtime premium, and we conclude that the overtime premium based on this weighted average is $8.94. So then we simply pull those 4 overtime hours down, multiply it times the overtime premium, and this is the add-on for overtime, $35.76. So we go back to our $622.80 job A, $164 job B, and then the overtime premium. The difference between these two results in a lower total gross pay because this overtime premium here is lower than it was up here. See, it was $10.25 up here. Here it's $8.94. So this is something that employers in a properly disclosed situation come to an agreement with their employees about how that's going to be calculated. Now down here on the third method, this is a more logical method. If we asked you before you ever heard of these methods which method should be used, and you would probably conclude in fairness to both sides that, well, you should be paid an overtime premium based on the type of job you were working when you worked overtime. So in situations where that is easily determined, it's possible, you're not jumping back and forth between job A and job B during your overtime to complicate the calculation. This is a logical alternative, and we're simply going to use here an overtime premium based on the job you were working on when you worked your overtime, and in this example that happened to be job B. So we wind up with the very same answer, $827.80, as we did with method 1, simply because our overtime premium is based on that job B rate, which is the higher rate. Okay, now we've got to enter into another topic here that's very important. It involves a little bit more detail in the calculation. You regularly encounter employment agreements where non-exempt employees, and those are employees that the payroll must follow the Fair Labor Standards Act. Exempt employees do not have to follow the Fair Labor Standards Act with regard to minimum wage, hours worked during the week, and those kinds of things. But we're in a non-exempt situation here, and we have an agreement where they're not paid an hourly rate, they're paid a salary or a period wage rate. So you work possibly a 40-hour week and you're paid X dollars per week. That can be the way the agreement is described. And when that happens, we run into some issues when we're trying to calculate overtime. So let's look at how we would approach that. And this is an important series of steps. We're going to use this series over and over again to calculate several of these overtime issues when there's a period wage rate rather than an hourly wage rate. Okay, this is number 1 always. We've got to push up whatever we're given to an annual salary. And the reason we have to do this is because what our goal is to break it back down to a weekly salary. Because our overtime law is always described fundamentally when we're dealing with overtime is a 40-hour week, in excess of a 40-hour week. And now there's some exceptions to that, but that's the basis. So to get an understanding of what the overtime is and how to compute it, you first have to get to that weekly number of hours worked in the weekly gross. So how do we get there? Whatever data we're given, we want to push it up to create an annual salary from that agreement. So if we're given a per weekly amount, a per monthly amount, we're going to push it up to an annual salary. And then from that, we can divide it by 52 weeks in a year, and get the weekly gross, and then divide that by usually 40 if the agreement is a 40-hour week. Usually 40, not always, but usually 40, we get an hourly rate of pay from that calculation. From that, then we can quickly get our overtime rate, 1.5 times the regular hourly rate. We can add the hourly rate times the overtime hours worked to get the add-on that we need for overtime pay, and add that to the regular gross pay. So these are the steps. The secret is get the annualized salary first, then divide it by 52 to get the weekly gross, to get it to that weekly level that we need to make the determinations that we need to make. All right, we're going to look at some examples here. And the number one issue in these examples is going to be rounding. And I'm going to spend some time trying to impress on you the importance of paying attention to rounding and how we can come up with wrong answers because we rounded differently than the convention or how we were asked to round something. So we're going to calculate some gross paychecks in this situation where we have a periodic wage, not an hourly wage. Let's take a look at this first one. The facts given to us here are that we have a $1,500 a month agreement for a non-exempt employee. They're paid weekly, and they work 43 hours in one pay period. So we're going to deal with that 43-hour pay period here. First, we annualize the salary, and here we see that done. 12 times 1,500, no issues, no questions about rounding. It is an $18,000 annual salary. But as soon as we divide, as soon as we take that $18,000 and divide, we're going to introduce rounding issues. And so this $18,000 divided by 52, the display here is telling us that the total is $346.15 weekly gross. Now that has been rounded. That is a rounded number, and we're going to open up Excel in a minute and go through this with Excel to show you how to watch out for that. Take into consideration now that 346.15 is a rounded number, and that is typically the convention that we follow. We round to the nearest cent in these calculations. Okay, once we have that, here again we're dividing, and here again, whenever you divide, you introduce potential rounding differences. So we have a regular rate that is also a rounded rate. It's rounded to the nearest cent, and we'll show you that in Excel as we proceed. But that is the number that we're after. We've been after that to try and figure out what is the overtime rate that we're going to use for these extra 3 hours that this employee worked. Multiplying the 865 by 1.5 times for the overtime rate, we get $12.98. We then can put together this information. The weekly gross we calculated up here, a rounded number. The $12.98, which has a rounding issue to it also because it comes from the 865, which is rounded. Multiply that by the 3 hours of overtime. There's our gross. Okay, we're going to go take a look at this in Excel to make sure we see that rounding in action and know what to do when we encounter it. Okay, here we have an Excel window open. I encourage you to do this when you're working on your homework. Get an Excel window open on the side. See the data set that you're working on. Here's the PowerPoint slide we were looking at. There's the data set. I also have it over in the Excel file here too. So let's look at these calculations. We have this $1,500 per month given to us in the data set. We multiply it by 12. We have $18,000 annual salary. No issues with rounding there, no problem. But down here, this cell right here, see, we're dividing the 18,000. See up here in the formula bar, we're dividing D9, the 18,000, by the 52 weeks in a year to come up with the weekly gross. Now look at the answer shown to us here is 346.15, but the actual, not rounded, answer is 346.15 and 38. So this 0.0038 amount is dropped in the rounding practice. When we round to the nearest cent. We round to this 5 in this hundredths position right here. We're going to round to that. We look at the number to the right. We look at the 3. Let me make this a little bit bigger. And when we do that, we look at that. We're going to round to the nearest cent. We want to round to the 5. And so we look at the number to the right of it. It's a 3. It's below 5. If it was 5 or above, we would round this 15 up. In this particular case, it's less than 5. It's a 3. So our rounded number, as shown here in the answer, is 346.15. You have to keep that in mind, and especially when you're working in Excel or on your hand calculator, it's carrying this decimal fraction if you don't round it. And so your calculation in the end can come out to be wrong or different because you didn't stop and round that number when you computed it. And the practice in general, unless you're instructed otherwise, is to round to the nearest cent in these calculations. Okay, I want to take this kind of to the extreme in Excel, because we've been looking at a display that showed us the answer when we make this division. We're dividing the 52 weeks into the 18,000. And we came to the conclusion it was $346.15 plus this 38 ten thousandths left over here. But in actual fact, it was even more lengthy than that. It's been truncated based on the display. If you squeeze the display down in Excel, it will either give you this, which says we can't show you what you want, or it will give you, it will, if the setup is such, it will just truncate it for you. It will cut it off and round the display, but the actual number within Excel continues to be this large number. When I right click on my mouse, I can start to show you how this little control up here changes the display for decimals. So I'm going to decrease decimal. See, I'm clicking on the decrease decimal icon here, and it's just changing the display. It is not rounding it for you. The number in there, if you use that number in a formula to calculate, is going to be this full untruncated long decimal fraction. Now I'm increasing it. See how huge it is? We finally run out of issues here where we wouldn't need to round if we were clear down to this point in that decimal fraction where we start hitting zeros. And of course there are numbers where it goes on to infinity, like pi, for example. But what I'm mostly after is not so much the math, but how it looks in Excel, because we can be fooled by it constantly. When we, if we're working in Excel and we see this number, we think, oh, well, that's the actual number. But no, you need to make sure, and you need to round it if necessary. Now, there is a way to make Excel round it for you, and I encourage you to start learning how to do that. This particular number in this cell is this formula here, which takes D9, this annual salary, and divides it by B10, which happens to be the number of weeks in a year. Okay, so what if you wanted that rounded to the nearest cent, and you didn't want to have to do it manually, and you wanted to use the result in this cell to compute something else, and you didn't want to carry this long decimal fraction that should have been dropped because rounding would have dropped it. There's a way to make Excel do it. So I'm just going to click up here and insert in front of that formula. I'm up in the formula bar. I'm clicking there, and I'm going to type round, the word round. That's a function in Excel. Then I'm going to put a parentheses, and then see this issue up here. This is a hint about what you need to do to finish the rounding formula. This is the number we're rounding, and the number is this formula here, D9 divided by D10. I put a comma. See the comma down here that's indicated right there? Put a comma in your formula, and then just tell us how many digits you want to round it to. We want to round to the nearest cent or 2 digits, and then close the door to complete the formula with another paren. And now when I hit enter, let's see what happens. There it's rounded to the nearest cent. And I can also change my display so that I don't have to see all those zeros. I can get it right down and show 2. Okay, now that number that we see is rounded. We forced it to be rounded by Excel. I can go pick that number in a formula. I can go back to this cell D10 and use it, and it won't bring any of that unrounded part of the answer which would cause me to come up with the wrong answer in many of these problems. So that's an important issue. Now furthermore, look, we come up here with an overtime rate of $8.65, and we got that by first getting the regular rate. We divided this 346.15 by 40. Well, very clearly, if you're going to do that in Excel, you got to make sure that the 346.15 is rounded correctly, and you can do that with that rounding. But even at that, here's the result of that. In this cell, we took this number, the regular weekly rate, divided it by 40 hours in a week. That's the regular rate. Well, it's not really 865. It's 865.375. It's a little bit more than 865. But our convention is, in these calculations, acceptable in practice, is to round that number to the nearest cent. So we're not going to use 865,375 times 1.5 to get our overtime rate, we're going to use 865 rounded. And why is it rounded to 865? It's because the number right next to 5 here, this number is less than 5. If this number was 5, we would round this from 5 to a 6. We would go up 1 to round it. Okay, then I wanted to point out one other thing. What if we were working along and then we did this calculation, and then we found the regular total, and then we got our overtime rate, which is 1.5 times the regular rate. So here, this formula is just taking this number right here, which is rounded. It's just typed in. It's not a formula. See, it's just typed right in, rounded. We take that times 1.5. Here is our overtime rate, but we have to round it and see how it's rounded over here in the answer. 1298, not 12.975. Why is it an 8 and not a 7? Is because the number to the right of it is 5 or greater. We go up. We raise it by 1. Okay, so what I want to point out here is, what if I took this number, this rounded number, and said, oh, I want to get back to my weekly gross. So let me multiply this times my 40 hours. And I do that in this cell here. I just go grab this number. It's my rounded weekly rate times 40 hours. What number do I get? I get $346. But the actual rate weekly is $346.15. And that is this 18,000 divided by 52 and rounded to 2 decimal places. In other words, when you round a subsequent number that you derive from that by division, you round it and you drop off the rest of that fraction, you can't get back to where you started. You get 346 instead of 346.15. So don't make that error either. Don't reconstruct the total weekly gross using your rounded hourly rate, because you won't get back there when there's rounding, and in most cases there is a rounding issue to deal with. So keep that idea in mind. Rounding is frustrating, it's challenging, it's difficult, and the most difficult thing, because I'm encouraging you to work in Excel, is that when you see a number in Excel, you often just begin to assume, well, that's the actual number here. I see this number 865,375. Well, that's the real number. But if I told Excel to decrease the number of decimals, and you didn't know that, let's move it clear down here. If I told them to only show that many decimals, Excel's going to round the display. That it's displaying 8.7, but it's not really 8.7. Underneath them, mathematically, it's a much different number. Here it is. Here's the real number mathematically. It's that number right there. So keep that in mind, and you'll be less frustrated with all these calculations, and you'll be able to use Excel to your advantage. Okay, to illustrate this, how it affects your homework and how it affects your test quiz questions and those kind of things, I opened up a Cengage Now problem in Chapter 2. We're going to be computing some overtime and gross earnings in many different situations, as we'll see. But see right up here, if required, round your answer to 2 decimal places and use the rounded answer in subsequent computations. So you got to be very aware of it. It's the number one issue that you need to be concerned about, because it brings in more frustration than anything else. You're on the right track, you use the right numbers in your computation, and the answer turns out to be wrong because you didn't do this. You didn't use a rounded hourly rate. You left it in Excel at the non-truncated rate, the long decimal fraction, and you came up with a different answer. That's another reason why we have this new feature, Check My Work, in these, and you have 2 Check My Works here, so you catch a lot of things, a lot of errors you make, but the number one thing you're probably going to catch yourself doing is overlooking a rounding issue at some point. Okay, so that gets us through one example of calculating a gross paycheck, dealing with rounding correctly, and getting our total gross pay when there's an overtime situation. Let's go look at another one. This example 2 here gives us a different data set, and I also put some of these facts into Excel so we can kind of check the calculation as we go. So what's the first thing we do? We have $2,000 a month periodic pay to a non-exempt employee, so we must deal with overtime. We pump it up to an annual salary. No issues there. That's not a problem. $24,000 annually. But because the pay period is semi-monthly now, we have to arrive at that pay period because we're going to use that in our calculation, that regular pay period total. So we divide the $24,000 by 24 semi-monthly periods in a year. Semi-monthly, their regular paycheck without overtime is $1,000. No rounding issues there. There could be, but there are no rounding issues there. Then we have to get it down to our weekly, because we always need to be at weekly to determine the overtime issue, because it's described or defined. Overtime is defined as more than 40 hours a week, basically. So we're dividing by 52. We get $461.54 displayed here as the answer to that. All right, so we're going to go look at Excel and see what the real issue was there with that calculation. Okay, so I'm in Excel here, and here is that calculation. It's only showing 4 decimals. There could be more to see, and indeed there are. When I open up the column up here, this is a technique I made the column bigger. It says, oh, well, actually, this is the number of decimals that should be displayed in that calculation if you want an exactly precise answer. And I could go to Excel and say, now show me everything, and I could keep clicking on this increased decimal and see this is a very, very long fraction. We may not even get to the point where it stops having a number in those subsequent decimal places. So very much this was not really mathematically 461.54. It was this number here, and we're only seeing part of that number here. But in accounting and in payroll and under the law, we're not going to deal with that very long, precise fraction. We're going to round it to the nearest penny, the nearest cent, round it to 2 decimal places. And so that's how we arrive at this 461 regular rate. Then, when we divide this number, this 461.54 rounded by 40 hours to get our hourly rate, which we have to get our premium, here's the actual number that Excel calculates, $11.53 plus cents. Well, rounded, that is $11.54. So the procedure you're trying to follow is in Excel. You should technically round this number, and you could put a rounding issue in here, or you can just retype it next to it. When you observe, you can look at it and round it yourself. You can look at that and say, oh, I should round up to 54, and you could type that in and then use that number in your calculation. That works. But you can also force it to be rounded by Excel, and I encourage you to start to do that. So to force that formula, D8 divided by B10, to get us our weekly gross, which is taking this annual salary, dividing it by 52 to get the weekly gross. I can make Excel round it for me. I can click here, remember, put the word round, tell Excel I want to use that function, I want to round, hit a parentheses. As soon as Excel knows what you're trying to do, it gives you this little tip down here. This is what you need in your round formula. So my number is this formula. It can be as complicated as you want to make it. It can be a number, it can be cell references, it can be a formula like we have here, D8 divided by B10. So then I put my comma, and then I type how many digits? 2, rounding to the nearest cent, 2 digits. Close the door and hit enter, and I get this number rounded in. Now I've told Excel to show me lots of decimal places, and I can fix that. I can decrease those. I can get those back down to where it's just showing where it's rounded to. So again, don't be misled by what you see in Excel. Investigate and see what really is the number underneath, because you can carry a rounding error to your final answer and be wrong. Get it marked wrong. Get it, and you can be in practice. You can wind up, one person can calculate a total gross pay and gets one number. Another person gets a different number. We have to be consistent. We have to follow the common practice, and that common practice is around to 2 decimal places. So Here we have our hourly rate based on this weekly gross that we calculated and rounded, divided by 40, because it is a 40-hour week in this situation. So this guy should be rounded too, and so we can do the same thing. We can insert that formula if we need to. But it's $11.54 regular rate. Now, again, as I pointed out in the previous example, if I took that $11.54 and I tried to get back to my weekly gross, I tried it in this cell right here. I took $11.54, multiplied it by 40 hours in a work week. Here's the answer I got, $461.60, but the real weekly gross we computed up above is $461.54. It's 6 cents difference. Why is that? Well, it's because we rounded up. We rounded 5385 to 54. So every hour in those 40 hours in this calculation, we awarded more compensation, but it was just due to rounding. And so we don't want to use this number. It won't work. We have to go back to this number. That is the basic weekly gross. But we are going to use the rounded up number to get our overtime. And that's why the overtime rate is $17.31. It's 1.5 times this rate. So then that completes these calculations. We go back to our amount, semi-monthly amount, this $1,000, and then we have this 4 hours overtime. We don't have any detail about other hours because it's not an issue here. Somebody sorted that out for us and said, all right, it's just 4 hours of overtime. So that's where this part of the calculation comes in, 4 hours of overtime, plus the regular $1,000 you get paid for working your 40-hour weeks for that time period. So that's another example. We're going to move on and do a few more of these examples to make sure we cover most situations you're going to run into. Okay, in this example number 3, let's look at the facts quoted. This is going to throw a little curve at us here. We have a non-exempt employee, so we know we worry about overtime. They're paid $2,000 a month, but the agreement is not for a 40-hour week. The agreement is you only have to work 38 hours a week, and you get $2,000 a month when you do that. That's the deal, so keep that in mind as we go forward. When overtime is worked, then, we wind up with 2 rates in overtime. One rate would be the rate to get us from 38 to 40 hours, and that would be the regular rate. No overtime premium, because under the law you don't have to pay overtime until you hit 40 hours. And then if they work more than 40 hours and actual overtime that falls under the Fair Labor Standards Act, then we have to get our premium, our 50% more for those hours after 40. Of 16 hours of overtime in this pay period, only 12 were over the 40. So this is the data set we're going to work with. What do we do first? We push it up to the annual salary. We show it here, $24,000. No issues, no rounding, no problem. We find out what the semi-monthly, where our pay period is semi-monthly, so how much do you get semi-monthly if your quoted salary is $2,000 a month? Well, to arrive at that, we have to do this calculation. Take it to the annual level, divide it by the number of semi-monthly time periods in a year, we get $1,000 semi-monthly. And that's to work 38-hour weeks. Keep that in mind. So now we need to take this to the weekly rate, and rounding, there was no rounding here, that is a rounded number, but there likely is going to be rounding here, and we need to go check that in Excel. They're telling us the answer, the weekly rate, dividing 52 weeks into the annual salary, is $461.54. Actually over here, here's what it is in Excel. Now I can open this up and show you there's even a longer fraction, but that's what we saw, and it's even longer than this if I showed you all the points. So this is simply this number here. The formula is taking this number, annual salary, divided by 52 weeks. That's the weekly rate we get. Certainly not what we see here, but we're compelled to round it, to enter a rounding formula into it. Okay, so this is a number we're going to use. We recognize that it's rounded. It was rounded up. All right. What's the regular hourly rate? We take our rounded $461.54. This number is rounded to the nearest cent. we divide it by 38, not by 40, because the agreement was you get this pay for a 38-hour week. So the regular rate is this 461.54 divided by the agreed upon number of hours in this employee's work week, $12.15. Now that almost certainly has rounding issues in it. And so over here, what I've done is taken a formula here to get that hourly rate, this number divided by this number. Now I haven't rounded this number yet, and if I round this one, I come up with the same number that we have over here at 12.15 versus 12.1457. This, if it's rounded, would be 12.15, no problem. So we have to be careful when we divide by the 38 hours. This is something we're doing here. Right here, divide by the 38, we get 12.15. The actual Excel displayed, what we can see of it is this number here, but it would be rounded correctly even here to the 12.15. Let's see what happens if I force this to be rounded in Excel so that my calculation using 38 hours dividing it into this cell, let's see what happens. And just watch to see if this number changes when I force this one to be rounded to 2 decimal places. I'm just going to, there I put that formula in there, and see, you can see that this number changed slightly. See that change down here in these decimals? It did change. You would expect it to change, but it didn't affect the rounding. Okay, and so caution here is, make sure you're using a rounded number to do subsequent calculations, which we are here. Now this guy also has to be rounded. I can make him round in Excel by putting in my round formula, my round function, I should say, and get him to go where he's supposed to go, so I don't have to worry about it. I don't have any issues. I'm forcing it to be rounded. There we go, and we come up with our 12.15. And then when I multiply that times my hourly premium, I go, in this cell I typed equals my rounded hourly rate times my 1.5, and I get this, and guess what? Here we have rounding again. Completely expected that was going to be the case. Let's show some more decimals. So in this case, I'm showing more decimals that it stops needing to be rounded here, but we can't use that number. We have to round it to the nearest cent. So I can simply do it visually, manually. I can round it, or I can make Excel do it. And again, there's that technique to do that. I encourage you to start using it. And so we come up with our 1823, and I can again get that back down to the way I like to see it in Excel. I can decrease the decimal down to the nearest cent. So there we go. That number is the actual mathematical number in Excel now. It would use 1823 period in a formula, and it would work. So I could then use that to multiply by my 12 hours. I could put my 12 down here and calculate that overtime premium equals 12 times this number here, and I would get the correct amount. If I watch what happens to this number here, if I don't round up here, and if I took my rounding detail out of here, and let me do that here. Okay, watch what happens to that number. See, it changes. We get a different we get a different answer, and we can check that, increase the number of decimals. So it is imperative that you're continually worried about rounding, and I suggest take the headache away from you, if at all possible, by forcing Excel to be rounded, forcing Excel to have that rounding formula in it when you go forward. Okay, that's probably enough about rounding on this issue. Let's get back to the calculations here. So that's a rounded number. We use this rounded number times 1.5 to get the overtime rate. The overtime rate had to be rounded as well to 1823. So then we can do our total computation. And big picture, what do we have to worry about? We have to worry about the regular pay for the 38-hour week, and so they get $1,000. Okay, and then of the 16 hours of overtime were worked, so 4 of those hours, the difference between the amount over 40 and 16, those are at regular rate of pay. It's just getting the employee up to 40 hours. The employer doesn't have to pay a premium for that. It doesn't hit the 40-hour federal law yet. So this is the amount of overtime they get, overtime pay they get for those first 4 hours of overtime. And then the remaining 12 hours of overtime here times the premium rate, the 1.5 times $12.15. Add these three numbers together and we get this total gross. Change any one of these hourly calculations by not rounding it, you'll get a different gross. And so rounding is critical. Let's go take a look at another one. We have 5 of these to do. There's 2 more, and they're trying to introduce all of the situations that you could run into in real life and in the problem sets that we're working on. Okay, in this particular one, number 4, what's the data set here? The data set tells us we have a non-exempt employee. We're going to worry about overtime then. $1,600 a month is their quoted salary, and they only have to work a 35-hour week, and they're paid semi-monthly. Okay, then we have a discussion of what the overtime is. But because their regular week is 35 hours, we know we're going to have this overtime issue to get to 40 hours where they're only paid the regular rate, and we have to discover what that regular rate is. So we take our quoted monthly salary times 12 to push it up to an annual gross. We divide the annual gross by the number of semi-monthly pay periods in a year, because that's how they're paid. We do that division. They get $800 semi-monthly, twice a month, 24 times during the year as a regular pay, and for that they work a 35-hour week. They worked 16 hours of overtime in the particular pay period we're worried about. 6 hours are over the 40-hour weekly. So that would mean 12 hours are going to be at the regular rate. 10 hours are going to be at the regular rate, 16 hours of overtime minus 6 hours that are over 40. So the under 40 overtime hours are 16 minus 6, or 10 hours. Okay, so let's continue the calculation. We have our annual gross. We've got to get it to a weekly view. We have to see it weekly to do our overtime calculation. We divide 19.2 by 52, and this is the rounded weekly rate. The Excel, it's a much longer number, a much longer decimal fraction. Here it is up here, and you see it. But rounded, it's still 369.23, rounded to 2 decimal places. So be sure, if you're using Excel, to force that to be rounded if you want to use that cell in a subsequent formula. Okay, so we have our regular weekly rate. We divide the weekly rate here by 35 because that's the agreement, not 40, but a 35-hour work week. We have a rounded rate here. The real rate is over here. It's rounded up because it was 54.9, so we round it to 55. That's the regular rate we're going to use in our calculation to determine the overtime rate, 1583. And again, the overtime rate is rounded up. Yet again, 82.824 to 0.83, which we see here. So this particular situation wound up with having 2 roundups in it, but that's how it's done, and that's what we do and use in our calculation. So then getting back to what's the total gross paycheck here? Well, here's their regular pay of $800. We computed that here. Here is the overtime at the regular hourly rate. We use the rounded regular hour rate here of 10.55 times the 10 hours. Where do we get that? 16 minus 6, 10. That's the overtime component of pay for the hours to get up to 40 hours in a week. And then we had 6 hours that are over 40 hours. And so those 6 hours are multiplied times the overtime rate, which is the rounded rate of 1583. Add all those together, we come up with $1,000.48 gross. We're going to move on and look at the last, or the 5th example here next. Okay, in this example here are the facts. We have a salary quota to a non-exempt employee, $2,200 a month. They're paid bi-weekly, That's different, remember, than semi-monthly. Got to watch it, got to be careful. But let's first get this into an annual view. 12 months, 2,200 a month, 26,400 annually. How much is your regular paycheck? Well, you're paid bi-weekly. So we divide our annual salary by the number of bi-weekly periods in a year, 52 divided by 2, 26. So here we have this $1,015.38. That is the bi-weekly gross pay they get under this agreement. Okay, and I showed that calculation here. $1,015.38 is the displayed answer, but up here it is, 26,400 divided by 26 biweekly pay periods. That's what Excel is telling us. That's what we can see of what Excel is telling us. Likely even longer than this, but this is a rounded number. We wanted to round to the nearest cent or to the 8. We look at the 8, we look to the right, it's below 5. Leave it alone. Drop everything else. Round down. That's why our answer here is $1,015.38. Okay, so now that we have that, we also need to get into the weekly view to do our overtime calculation. So we must also calculate the weekly rate. This is their regular pay rate to work their regular schedule. And this is the weekly rate view that we have to do our overtime calculation. So the answer shown here, 507.69. Here it's calculated in Excel, and you can see that that wasn't the exact number. It was rounded. Everything past the 9 was dropped because it was below 5. The 2 is less than 5, so it was dropped to 69. That's the regular rate that we computed. Okay, that is an important step to get to the overtime amount of pay. And so we multiply this rounded 1269 times 1.5 and get 1904. Actually, it was this rate over here, 190385, rounded up to 1904, which is what we've done here. So to put all this together and finish this calculation, we take this number here, the $1,015.38 for their regular biweekly pay. That's the beginning. We're dealing with 11.5 hours of overtime. And in this problem, we use 40 hours. There is no discussion up here that there was an agreement to work 35 hours or 38 hours. So given that, we are allowed to assume, and we have to assume, that what they're talking about for this regular salary was a 40-hour week. So you have to kind of get used to that sometimes they don't reassure you, but you go to the default assumption in that case, 40 hours. 40 hours divided by that weekly rate. That's where we got this. We rounded it. We took our overtime rate, we rounded it, then we built our total gross. This is the regular pay, the biweekly amount that we got by going to an annual rate and dividing by 26. This is the overtime rate times the 11.5 hours of overtime it's stated that we worked in the problem. Add them together and we get our total gross of $1,234.34. So hopefully this does two things. I hope this just brings the rounding issue to the focus. You're going to deal with it all the way through this course. In accounting, you deal with it constantly and every day. You must be keen on it, and don't be fooled by what you see displayed in Excel or on your hand calculator or any other electronic calculator. Don't be fooled by that, because actually the number that's inherent in the system is a lengthy fraction, and we have to get it rounded to use it based on the practice in accounting, the practice in the Fair Labor Standards Act law that's been confirmed, and it is the conventional way that we do these things, so that we all arrive at the same answer. If many different people and situations are used to calculate the same thing, we need a consistent way, and that rounding gives us a consistent way to deal with that issue. Okay, so that concludes this integrity discussion here about calculating a gross paycheck, throwing in the overtime issue, dealing with a period pay instead of an hourly pay. We're going to move on and discuss some issues, especially the fluctuating work week problem, in the next integrity lecture.